Wayne Musabayana, and I'll be your moderator for this press briefing. So we heard from the chairperson of the African Union Commission just yesterday, when this very important conference started. And he was talking about COVID-19 and commenting that devastating as it has been on the continent, it has also created a historic opportunity to build a new public health order that can effectively guard against future health crises. And that this inaugural conference on public health in Africa is a first step in making this a reality. So what we will do, colleagues, is we will start with very brief comments from each of our panelists, and then we will go into a question and answer section. When we do get to that Q&A section, you can send in your questions to, and I'll give you this WhatsApp number. For those of you who are familiar with the previous one, please take note that today we are using a different WhatsApp number. And that number is +251 904 139935. That is +251 9041 39935. So that's the WhatsApp number for you to use. Alternatively, and as usual, you can come through on our question and answer section, as well as ask your questions live on this platform. So it's time for us now to go into our briefings. Let me just briefly tell you what each one of our speakers is going to be talking about. We will start with Dr. John Nkengasong, who is the director of the Africa CDC. And Dr. John will be re-emphasizing the importance of CPHIA and the emerging discussions towards a new public health order for the continent, as well as Agenda 2063. So it is over to you, Dr. John, for your first remarks this afternoon.
Thank you so much, Winnie, for the remarkable role you have played over the course of this pandemic in our ability to communicate with clarity to the external world, of course, including Africa. I also like to, first of all, relate to all the panelists who are friends and colleagues, how honored I am to join you in this discussion this morning or this afternoon. It is truly a historic moment we are living today. Since yesterday, with respect to the lifting and the implementation of the conference on public health in Africa, it truly provides a platform, as our political leadership articulated yesterday with clarity. President Kagame, chairperson of the African Union Commission, Excellency Moussa Faki, and other speakers, very clearly that this is exactly the kind of instruments that we needed to rally the continent to take its own health needs into its hands and create a platform for very intimate interaction in terms of exchange of science, policies, politics, and other advocacy for public health. The fact that this is the first conference on public health in Africa speaks volume. We are used to having silos of conferences, like the HIV/AIDS conferences that, of course, the continent has hosted and other specific, but never have we ever come together as a continent to articulate a vision for the continent in terms of offering a platform that will help us in the development of our Agenda 2063. I must say that I would also like to recognize the extraordinary and exceptional leadership of the political leaders of the continent. You heard them yesterday very clearly, and in other times you've heard champions like President Cyril Ramaphosa, who is the COVID champion for the continent. He wasn't there yesterday just because he fell ill to COVID, as you all know, as I did in August. So I use that as a segue to say that let me paint a picture of a virus that might emerge in future. And before I paint that picture, I would like to say that the Ebola outbreak in West Africa was perhaps a signal to all of us that something big was going to come. And hardly did the memories of that devastating outbreak died down, did COVID showed up. And just perhaps, COVID could be something that is telling us that we have to prepare aggressively for something even worse to come. And what is this something worse to come? And I'll say this and I'll end on that note. And argue that based on the picture that I'm going to paint, the continent should be in a rush to actually implement a new public health order, which is nothing strange. It speaks to the fact that we need to strengthen our national public health institutions and central bodies like the Africa CDC, so that we have a coherent approach. It speaks to workforce development, which we have chronic needs, not just for public health response, but for research. It speaks to the fact that we need to invest in our own research capabilities so that we generate that intellectual knowledge and innovation that is so critical, and shift the discussion from transfer of technology to co-sharing or co-creation of technology. It speaks to the fact that we have to manufacture on the continent quickly, and it also speaks to the fact that we're calling for alignment of what we call respectful, action-oriented partners and domestic investment. All of the virus in future that emerge that has a case fatality rate like the SARS outbreak that we witnessed in 2002, which was a pandemic, but just didn't spread as much. I mean, that outbreak or pandemic had a case fatality ratio of a rate of 15%, which is way higher than the SARS-CoV-2 virus. Also imagine that this hypothetical virus is so difficult to create a vaccine against, like HIV. I'm happy Slim is here. He has been in the battle, and Helen and others, you all have been in the battle to find a vaccine against HIV for years. Imagine that a virus emerged and is that. And then imagine that virus has the transmissibility of Omicron. And so, and that we also now put that in the context of Africa is waiting for vaccines to be developed or diagnostics so that we can receive it. If that virus will emerge, it is very fair and safe to say that some people like us who have been infected and benefited from vaccines that were imported on the continent, people like President Ramaphosa would not longer be here because, I mean, clearly it will be too late for us to wait for these vaccines to come to the continent. And if they come, who will get it first? So I'll end by saying that this conference is truly a platform for self-determination in public health of the continent. And we say that a continent of 1.2 billion people must take its own destiny into its hands and begin to invest in a new public health order. Thank you.
Thank you very much, John. And thank you for painting that picture for us of the situation should nothing be done at this particular moment in terms of all those elements in public health that you have outlined. Thank you so much for that presentation. We now move on to Professor Salim Abdul Karim, who is the director of CPHIA, and he's going to be speaking to us for the next 3 minutes. And he's going to be talking about the impact of COVID-19 on Africa's health systems, preparedness for the health emergency, and also highlight South African research on Omicron. Prof, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Winnie. It's a great pleasure to be with all of you here this afternoon. A big thank you to my brother John and to all of the colleagues who are joining us here today. When we think about COVID-19 a year ago, so just hark back to November. It was the 9th of November last year that we heard the first amazing announcement from a company called Pfizer in conjunction with its partner BioNTech, that they had shown a vaccine that was more than 90% effective against SARS-CoV-2. And so it came about that we had a virus, we had a vaccine, and now we had a potential endgame. We could vaccinate our population and that way keep the virus in check. It was barely a month later, on the 14th of December, that the UK scientists announced that they had discovered the Alpha variant. And 3 days later, a team of scientists from South Africa announced to the world that we had found the Beta variant. And we now have a very clear understanding that variants have changed the game. They have changed our ability to end COVID-19. We have to rethink how we're going to achieve that. And essentially what we are anticipating, that we will see more variants, and the variants will have increased transmissibility. That's what's going to enable them to overtake past variants, and they may have, to some extent, some immune escape. And so it comes about that a few weeks ago, South African scientists announced Omicron. So what about Omicron? Well, it's a virus that we now, with almost 2 weeks of data, we can say quite confidently that it is spreading at a rapid rate. At this time, its doubling time is about 25% faster than what we saw with the Delta variant. So we are in the midst of a virus that is spreading rapidly, probably even more rapidly than the Delta variant. Second thing that's becoming clearer is that it's not particularly more severe. If anything, the evidence points at this early stage, and so one must be cautious in over-interpreting it, that the data show that the virus is less severe. Let me give you one statistic that may be helpful from our national database, that in the past 3 waves, about 2 out of every 3 patients admitted to hospital around Tshwane, around the Pretoria area where the epidemic is most advanced, were severe cases. 2 out of 3 severe cases. Severe meaning requiring oxygenation, ventilation, ICU, or even death. At this time, the evidence we have from those same hospitals that of all the patients admitted under the Omicron, during this Omicron wave, we have seen less than 1 out of 4 that are severe. So even though patients are being admitted and admissions are increasing in South Africa, the severity of the illness is less. And what we've seen now from new data emerging in South Africa, in neutralization data and emerging clinical data from the UK, we are now seeing immune escape as we expected. But all of this was possible, and the research was possible because we prepared. And this wasn't preparing by accident. This was very careful thought, led by the African CDC, to establish a continental network of laboratories to undertake surveillance, to collect the essential information that gives us the power over this virus. The more we know about it, the less our uncertainty, the better able we are to cope with it. And so we have seen the value of science, and we've seen the importance of building public health and the institutions that enable us to deal with public health on the continent, like the African CDC. And so this conference is such an opportunity for us to share with the world science from Africa. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Prof. Salim. You gave us there a quick timeline of the progression of the disease, and also just debunked the common myth that Omicron is the worst variant ever. And we hope that this will help to feed in to inform those who are putting travel restrictions on some countries because of Omicron. So thank you very much, Prof, for that. We now move on and we say good afternoon to Dr. Ebere Okereke, who is the Senior Technical Advisor at the Tony Blair Institute for Global Change and an Honorary Senior Public Health Advisor to the Africa CDC. Dr. Ebere, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Ms. Winnie, and it's an honor to be sharing a platform with my public health heroes in Africa this afternoon. I wanted to reflect on some of the lessons that we've learned around our responsibilities for health security and what we need to do differently as a continent going forward. So much as we are continuing to struggle with the devastating impact of the COVID pandemic on the continent and the globe in general, it has actually provided some lessons and some clarity and provided the opportunity for concentration of minds politically, as well as amongst us public health professionals, researchers, scientists, and our private sector entrepreneurs and investors on how we need to have a responsibility and take ownership of our global health security. Too often and for too long, we have actually devolved responsibility for solutions for protecting our health security to the global architecture, because generally the tradition has been that it's a problem, it's an African problem for which the global North rally to our assistance as and when it fits into their narrative. With this global response, the pandemic now, we have seen, we have recognized that the existing global health architecture doesn't work in our interest, and we need to step in and take on some of our responsibilities ourselves. And that is part of what is reflected in the new public health order that we've discussed and been discussing throughout this conference. Strengthening our institutions, building our workforce, developing our partnerships. And the aspect I want to speak on specifically here is on manufacturing pharmaceutical products for our own health security needs. And that's both vaccines, therapeutics, and diagnostics. Throughout this pandemic, it has been our experience that we've been at the end of the queue for everything, from diagnostic tests to do COVID diagnostics, for PPE to protect our healthcare workforce, from the therapeutics for treating COVID patients, and most acutely and most important and relevant in the conversation around Omicron at the moment, from access to vaccines. And that's because we are wholly dependent on the global architecture for supply of these products for us. And we think we need to own recognition for the fact that we failed to respond as a collective to the experience in the past, for example, on HIV, where access to HIV treatment was very late coming to African patients, and the current situation that we still, even though we have the highest proportion of HIV patients in the globe, we still import all our diagnostics. So we actually do learn that lesson, and we are learning that lesson. And part of our response is developing the Partnership for African Vaccine Manufacturing, where we're working collectively as a continent and led by the African Union to develop our own solutions, to say, how do we develop the ecosystem to enable public-private collaboration to build up vaccine manufacturing for Africa. And this is not just for COVID, but starting with COVID because the opportunity presents itself, but to look beyond that, to aim for 60% of our universal vaccine needs to be developed and manufactured in Africa by 2040. Now, to do that, we do need to have all hands on deck. It's not just about building the actual manufacturers, it's about putting the whole system in place, bringing political, commercial, private equity, investors, science, and public health together to create this system that will put us in a much more secure position for the next pandemic, because we know that there will be another pandemic.
Thank you very much. That was Dr. Okereke who was speaking to us, and she is the Senior Technical Advisor at the Tony Blair Institute for Global Change and an Honorary Senior Public Health Advisor to the Africa CDC. Thank you so very much. Let's move on now and invite Dr. Githingi Gitahi, who is the Group Chief Executive Officer of
Seems the moderator has dropped off, so I'll proceed.
Yes.
Exactly. Thank you very much. Thank you, John, Professor Salim, and Dr. Ebere. And the first thing I would like to say is that the only thing that would make communities, countries retreat the way we've seen communities and countries retreat is war. So we must equate health insecurity to war, actually. And I think that's where we must invest in ensuring that, because now the threat of war globally is so much lower, the next biggest threat is actually health and health emerging viruses and other emerging microorganisms, as in John's hypothetical case. Now, we know that whereas economic and social development through changing social determinants of health increases the availability of health and healthy populations, it is predetermined on an investment in human capital to begin with. And we've seen that from countries like the UK and others that actually had to invest, and Japan had to actually invest first in human capital for them to gain socioeconomic development. So a breakdown in the health system is a breakdown in economic and social fiber. COVID has demonstrated that, and we see that extremely clearly. Therefore, when we talk about investing in equitable and resilient health systems that are able to prevent, detect, and respond, these are a prerequisite to Africa's social and economic recovery and growth. So we cannot extract healthy systems, universal health coverage, and health security from Africa's social and economic development. So we must see them as one package, and we must not see health as something separate from social and economic development. It is actually the foundation for this. And creating national public health institutes is not a separate agenda to a resilient health system. It is part of a resilient health system. It is like building a CCTV or a closed camera system for a security system. And without the closed camera TV system, then you can't say you have a security system. What you have is a reactive system. And if we do not build national public health capacity, which includes laboratory systems, leadership, and public health workforce that supports the health system to be able to prevent, detect, and respond to disease threats, then we cannot build a health system that is going to support social and economic recovery. But this, therefore, the national public health institutes that are part of a health system need to be created, supported, and networked so that there's a continent. They are not working independently. And this has been the role of Africa CDC to actually support regional collaborating centers, and those regional collaborating centers to be based on existing national public health institutes so that each country is part of the CCTV system, not one country and not one system, but actually each country connecting into this central spoke and hub unit. Of course, this requires that we work towards an independent, autonomous Africa Centers for Disease Control and Prevention that is able to support autonomous national public health institutes in countries that are well supported, financed, and also through technical capacity and also laboratory systems. We just came out of a discussion on the new public health order with African experts. So in closing, what I would like to say that we must build a system closer to communities, because that hypothetical virus that John talked about starts and ends with communities. And therefore, these national public health systems must be built closest to where the people live, work, and play. I would like to stop there. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm not sure this is now, I'll put my hand up. This is Professor Rees speaking. I think we might have lost our moderator. So I'm the next person to speak. So I'll come in, and I hope that we find our moderator again. So my colleagues have said an awful lot. What I was asked to talk about was, was research again, and also the new order. But to complement what's been said, I want to go back to what John referenced at the beginning, which was Ebola being a forewarning. And when we had the Ebola pandemic, several of us on this panel were involved in the discussions with WHO at the lead of how are we going to respond and how do we get clinical trials out there rapidly. And this was initially, as we know, in 3 West African countries. And what we found was, number one, that the world didn't have a good setup for clinical trials. They hadn't thought through, how do you just rapidly go into the field with a clinical trial When there's a pandemic, or in this case, it was outbreaks in these countries, how do you rapidly do that so that you catch the moment and you catch the wave and you get an answer? And what we did was we spent a long time sitting in rooms with very senior people actually arguing about what those clinical trials how they should be designed and how they should be implemented. And it was actually going back to the old smallpox trial that allowed us to find a solution for Ebola. So we did learn something from that, and we were better prepared in some ways. But if we look now at what has happened once again, and this is in the face of what we have heard, with African CDC being a huge leader in all of this, and independent research entities around the continent also putting their hands up big time. But if we look at what has actually come out of this, and you look at who's still doing the publications in research, there are 4 countries that have dominated. China, obviously, because they were the first, followed by Italy. Italy also, and that's a time-related thing. Those are the countries that had the first cases, clearly. And the US and the UK, and then we go on. And still, we're seeing this huge dominance of the high-income country researchers leading that kind of the research questions. So I think that we still got a long way to go. And I think that one of the things that COVID has allowed us to do is to start to challenge the old order. At the beginning, in addition to John's leadership in the African CDC, there was a coalition for research, clinical trial research in COVID. And one of the things that was set up to address was the fact that there was inadequate investment in research, as we've just heard. So we have made enormous progress, but then if we press the pause button and we move on to the new order, you think about the things that our leadership have said, and you'll have heard this many times now, but political leadership have stood up right at the beginning and said, we demand access to vaccines, the manufacturing that Dr. Berry has just noted, recognizing really for the first time, probably in terms of collective political leadership, how little manufacturing is going on in our region. And the manufacturing isn't putting up a factory. It is a continuum of A to Z of science. It is science and factories and health systems. It's a continuum. They also said, we are concerned about intellectual property, something that came up with HIV, but we're raising it once again. And the world hasn't come to a consensus, despite the WTO trying to take this matter on. And we still haven't come to a consensus on that. And most recently, what we've heard is that the closing down of borders is actually very harmful in the context of a pandemic. So one of the things the international health regulations it was set up to do was to prevent unnecessary closing of borders, movement of people, movement of resources. And at its worst, closing of borders means that research will suffer. So although we've learned a lot from the Ebola days, if you listen to what the political leadership is saying at the highest level, there's a whole lot of things that we still have not actually tackled and learned, and that we're going to have to come back to. And then finally, I think the one comment on research that I think that we shouldn't forget is that it's not only the technologies that we need, it's also the interface with our communities. And one of the things we have seen emerging is the importance of social behavioral research, and we should underscore that. In the area, I'll just give one example of vaccine hesitancy. I believe that one of the impacts of the delays in getting vaccines to our continent allowed false information, misinformation, and suspicion to creep in, and I think has contributed to vaccine hesitancy in many countries. But what we're seeing now is a response, which is people, researchers trying to understand it. Why is it there, and what is it that we need to do? And just to highlight that in that vaccine hesitancy, it's not just misinformation and social media, it's also that our health services are not patient-friendly. So we're trying to roll out vaccines where people have to walk long distances, have to queue a long time, are hungry standing in queues. So, when we think about the importance of understanding our continent and what is going to work, we have to think 360 degrees in the context of research. Thank you. I'll stop there.
And thank you, Prof. Rees. Professor Rees is the Executive Director at the Vets Reproductive Health and HIV Institute in South Africa. My name is Sikerelwa Mding, and I'm quickly stepping in for Wayne, our moderator. And in the interest of time, I want us to move directly to the quick Q&A session. We already have two colleagues, Sarah Jerving and Sophie Mokoena. I'll start with you. You can ask your questions directly to the panelists, briefly starting with the introduction and which media outlet you're representing. Thank you. Sarah?
Thanks so much. I'm a reporter with DevX. Dr. Gathai, what are some of the challenges many countries might face in establishing national public health institutes, and what kind of steps should they take as priority? Thank you.
So I proceed and answer that question.
You may proceed, Dr. Gitinji, and then after your response, Sophie Mokoena, you can ask your question. Colleagues, if you want questions in the chat, we'll also go through them. And then after 3 questions, the panelists will respond. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sarah. And the challenges that we've seen are, one is political will, that we need political will in a country to establish the National Public Health Institute. And that requires political mobilization, needs to the conversation with the political leadership that actually this is an investment, not an expenditure. So that is critical. The next one is building the laboratory strengthening system and the leadership of it. A national public health system requires a strong diagnostic and laboratory system that has good leadership. And the third point is the mandate, that a National Public Health Institute needs to have the mandate to do the things it needs to do. We've seen challenges, what has been talked about here, that if you have a National Public Health Institute or a disease surveillance system that doesn't have the mandate it requires, then you have a challenge. So countries will need to change their legislation. They'll need to put in the bills or the acts that are necessary to support the National Public Health Institutes. And finally, it's the workforce. That if you don't have adequate workforce, we know in Africa we have a big challenge. Some of the data shows that Africa needs 6,000 epidemiologists. We have only maybe 1,900. So a public, a health workforce that supports the national public health infrastructure is so critical, and that might be Africa's starting point. That might be actually what we may call ground zero to develop the national public health workforce that supports this infrastructure. Those are the ones I would like to highlight at top of my mind. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Gitinji. Sophie Mokoena from SABC Johannesburg.
Thank you so much. My question is directed to Professor Abdul Karim, Dr. John Kenkasong, and Professor Rees. The discovery, or when South Africa detected the Omicron variant, we then learned that Botswana discovered the variant a few days before we went public. And now the Secretary of Health in the United Kingdom is saying that the United Kingdom was the first country to discover this variant. What's the truth? And also, Botswana not going public, was that a correct decision? Because as a region, SADC and the continent, particularly South Africa, because we went public, we then had to suffer the consequence of being transparent, when clearly, if the 4 diplomats who visited Botswana detected this variant, had Botswana went public in terms of that discovery or the outcome, and also mentioning the countries, not necessarily the individuals, was it not perhaps, would it not have helped, rather than us now becoming this dark continent with diseases again and being locked out? And finally, building capacity on manufacturing and research. Are we doing that on the continent with the energy and, political will it deserves? Because if we don't do that, 100 years again, we might be having a pandemic, and we are likely to be found wanting, having to depend on the developed North that has clearly not demonstrated a political will to support the developing South. Thank you.
Dr. John, I think because that question is three-way, we can start with you, and the rest of the colleagues Sophie mentioned can also build on from your response. Dr. John?
No, thank you. Let me start with what others have said. We have said it at Africa CDC and African Union all the time. Sincere congratulations to the hardworking scientists of South Africa for identifying this variant, and not just this variant, but the other beta variant as well. And secondly, and releasing those results in a timely fashion. I think it should go back, it should go down in the history of this pandemic that South Africa's contribution in this area of variant has been remarkable, and it should be documented as such. And it should be a model where the world should be aspiring to go to. And I think we are very clear on that as Africa CDC and African Union Commission. Detecting a variant in a country doesn't mean that it started there. For sure, we need to do some very, what I call forensic genomic analysis to pin down where it started, but it doesn't really matter. I mean, what matters is that you pick it up, you reported it, and then the world did something positively with, okay, you expect that the world would use that information positively to continue to fight this pandemic. We are acting with this Omicron as if it is the last variant, and it will not be the last. Prof, as Karim said it very well, I mean, it is not going to be that. I'm not a prophet of doom. I said this months ago when we were all focused on Delta as if Delta was the last thing that we ever see that. And I said, and Sophie, you recall this, we've discussed this during the Thursday's conference, press conferences all the time. I said, I just want to be very clear, there will be a food wave, there will be a feed wave, there will be many more variants that you can. So what should really be the centrality of our conversation is how do we deal with the variants? How do we communicate with the variants? How do we have policies that will not enable us to panic and then create further distrust across all of us as humanity so that we can tackle this virus in the most appropriate way? Let me just end by saying this, sharing with you the anecdote, which some of you already know. Now, it is the way the narrative is out there is as if Omicron is a new virus that has emerged. It is not a new virus. It's a variant of the COVID virus, which means the same things that we do to prevent infection from COVID will work for that, the variants, okay, the alpha, the beta, which include go out there and get vaccinated. Wear your mask, social distance. All these variants will respect these barriers, would always help us to prevent prevent the transmission of this variant. Lastly, is that when you report something, very unfortunately, you get labeled with that. You all know the history of the Spanish flu. It is not because that 100 years ago the Spanish that virus was identified in Spain, but it was because there was a media embargo for many countries not to report on that pandemic. But Spain was very vocal on that and was reporting on it, so it was labeled the Spanish flu. So I think if you just go down 100 years ago in the history of pandemics, I mean, whoever discovers something, whoever talks about something so much is likely to be labeled, and we should be working to undo that, so that we live more in the logic of let's find things quickly, take action, and contain them.
Just to add briefly, I think Dr. Nkengasong has covered the issues quite well. You know, people will want to rewrite history to make it slant in the way in which it looks best for them. But we know what the facts are, and as far as I'm aware, the earliest report of Omicron on GISAID, which is the international database, comes from our colleagues in Botswana. Without question, they were the ones to first load it up on GISAID. They didn't make a song and dance about it. It was a single sequence. And so they just loaded it onto the system. 2 days later, a second sequence was loaded onto the GESAID database, and that came from Hong Kong on a South Africa, on a person who had come back from South Africa. So those were the two existing sequences on GESAID. Shortly after the Hong Kong uploading, a researcher from the Sanger Institute sent out a tweet saying that he noted these two variants and that they had multiple mutations. But it wasn't until about a week later that a small outbreak occurred in Pretoria among university students. And it just happened that the president of the head of our medical association was one of those that saw one of those patients, referred that patient for a test. And at the laboratory, which is a private laboratory, 6 people were tested from that outbreak. And this technician who did the test noticed something unusual. They use a very specific test called a Thermo Fisher PCR, and she noticed that one part of it was negative. And so she thought something was wrong with the test. So she did it again. And she then sent it for sequencing. So they did, in the private laboratory called Lancet, they did the first set of sequences. When they saw what it was, they sent it through to the NICD that shared it with the National Genomic Platform. Now, I got to see the six sequences when it got to Professor D'Oliveira, when he found it and he showed it to me. And that was at least a week after our colleagues had already reported it from Botswana. So that's how the whole story gets about. And we said, we're not going to say anything until we're absolutely confident that this is, really a virus that's spreading. And so we tested, Professor D'Oliveira and his team, within a matter of 48 hours, no, not even that, 24 hours, they tested 100 samples. And they showed that 76 of those 100 were the same Omicron variant. That thing didn't have a name. We just, on the phylogenetic tree, we call it on the B one is B1.591. So when we saw that, that was the announcement that was made. So it was just that South Africa announced that we were seeing a rapidly growing number of cases of this variant. We weren't the first to actually report it. If others want to claim they were the first to have it or to report it, they're welcome to it. But those are the facts as I'm aware of them.
Thank you, Professor. I will move to the second round of questions. We've got a number of them, so we'll ask our individual speakers to tackle each of them. The first one's coming from the Front Page Africa in Liberia. The first question we will pose to Dr. Ibere, and it says, how effective, affordable, and trusted are vaccines that are being distributed in low-income countries? How effective, affordable, and trusted are vaccines that are being distributed in low-middle-income countries? And the second one goes to Dr. John. And it says, what monitoring policies has the Africa CDC instituted in order to ensure the decentralization of the vaccines, especially in underdeveloped countries? What policies are in place from the Africa CDC in order to ensure the decentralization of vaccines? And then another question, which we have from Rachel, a senior correspondent from the news agency in Nigeria. This, Dr. Gitinji, I'll pose to you because this is some of the work that you've been doing through AMREF. How can the continent win vaccine hesitancy, which is now a major challenge on the continent? And then the last two questions, they come from Jonah from Mozambique. And his first question here in the chat, it says, data shows that less than 10% of the population is fully vaccinated against COVID-19. What must be done to increase the number of vaccines in Africa? Prof. Slim, this I'll hand your way. And the last one for you, Professor Helen Rees. What paths must be followed in order to reduce inequalities in access to health services in the continent? And I think this speaks to the heart of what the conference is trying to address over the next 2 days. I'll start with you, Dr. Ibere. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So the question I'm responding to is how effective and affordable are the vaccines that are available for COVID? So first of all, the most important thing is whichever vaccine you have access to, get it. The most important thing is to get a vaccine in your arm. Now, there are quite an increasing number of formulations of vaccine, different technologies that are available across the globe at the moment. And in Africa, we have access to an increasing and improving access now to a very number of them. So the first thing is actually that I don't think the issue here for us has been necessarily affordability. We had, and Dr. John referred to that at the beginning of his opening remarks about how the African investment banks stepped up to provide funding for us to be able to procure and buy vaccines once they became available. There was also the COVAX facility, which was to pool resources to make these vaccines available. The biggest challenge has been actually the pace of production. And then, of course, the subsequently also hoarding of supplies by some of the more affluent countries. So the issue of the cost is not the immediate challenge, because we don't think that the funding is the issue. It's actually about meeting the demand. And then the next phase is also getting it from arrival into people's arms, where the issue of hesitancy comes in. So that's the issue around affordability. In terms to effectiveness, again, that varies from vaccine to vaccine, and also varies to an extent in by the variants. And as Prof. Salim just very clearly articulated, the current evidence that we're getting about Omicron suggests that it might evade some of the vaccine immunity. But nevertheless, any vaccine is better than no vaccine. All we understand at the moment is that having a vaccination is more likely to give you the sort of immunity to protect you than even recovering from COVID on its own. And then now the evidence is suggesting that a third booster might be relevant to strengthen response and to protect us against the capacity for the Omicron variant to partially evade the immune response. But where we are now currently on the continent, we're still at less than 10% of our populations across the continent being fully vaccinated. So our priority has got to be, whatever vaccine we get, let's get that into arms. We're not getting vaccines that haven't gone through rigorous trials and standardization, and they have all been approved by appropriate regulatory authorities before we start to distribute them. So our primary goal is whichever ones that we can get hold of, we'll get them into people's arms. Thank you.
You're muted.
Apologies. Yes, the next answer will come from Dr. John around Africa CDC's policies around decentralization. Briefly, Dr. John, thank you.
No, absolutely. You've heard from Dr. Ebered about, and she spoke during her introductory remarks about the Partnership for African Vaccine Manufacturing, which was launched in April 12 and 13, to be very specific, by President Tshisekedi, the chair of the African Union. So that platform has developed. And just last week in Kigali, we presented updates at a very big conference that we hosted. About close to 6,000 people attended on the virtual platform, and President Kagame was there. So there's a lot of progress there. So as Dr. Ebere mentioned, the PAM is an ecosystem, which says that we are warehousing mechanism where any country that wants to manufacture vaccines can come in and learn how to do it. We can also help to facilitate them. There are about 6 or 7 work areas that we are working across the continent so that everybody feels comfortable in that space. Africa CDC doesn't determine who would manufacture vaccines on the continent, but we facilitate and coordinate our efforts so that as a continent, we have a unified approach to it. So we will not be issuing policies on who should produce a vaccine and who should not. I mean, we will provide an enabling environment for open discussions, communication, advocacy, and mechanisms to advance it. For example, one of the main reason we met in Kigali was to provide a mechanism for issuing emergency use authorization on the continent. In case a country X begins to produce a vaccine, say in the next 12 months, what do we do? So that it squares within the spirit of taking our own destiny into our hands. The continent of Africa, and I might be wrong here, is the only part of the world that still relies on somebody else to say that, look, we've looked at a vaccine or a product and you can use it. China, Russia, United States, Europe, Brazil do not do that. They work collaboratively with everyone else, but they provide the final authority on how their people will use products. In Africa, a continent of 1.3 billion people needs to aspire, and that's why we are very excited with the creation of the AMA, the African Medicine Agency, which again, the spirit of why we're in Kigali was to see ways that we can work and strengthen AMA so that AMA begins to be operationalized and take their responsibility, which is enabling the production of vaccines on the continent from the regulatory angle.
Thank you. And then we have Dr. Kidinji on the question of vaccine hesitancy on the continent.
Well, I would like to say that it's very difficult to be hesitant for something you actually don't have. So I see this as a supply issue rather than a demand issue. And let me explain that. If you look at the Africa CDC website, and also Lancet and others, there have been a lot of published data on surveys on vaccine confidence. And African countries, of course, not every country is the same. There are some that have a much lower confidence level than others, but on average, African acceptance and vaccine confidence is very high, actually much higher than some of the other continents. The US has actually been incentivizing people to take vaccines through cost of up to $100 per person, or food vouchers and this kind of thing. We don't have that kind of money in Africa to actually incentivize people for vaccines. So what we have now, if I was to look at the spectrum of the vaccines, I would say we want to achieve, let's say we want to achieve 100%. The data I've seen shows that in many countries, vaccine confidence is up 78%. Now, where are we now? We are at about 10%, so to say, for argument's sake. The gap between the 10 and the 78% vaccine confidence is supply side problems and access and logistics. That's where the gap is. The other part of 78 to 100, which could have a contributor to hesitancy, is what we need to deal with when we've actually dealt with the supply and access issues. And these access issues are not purely, they are related to human behavior. For example, we recently went out to the field to do an outreach for vaccines on a Saturday. Where we were doing the vaccine outreach was right next to a health center. A health center is a vaccinating center. I asked the nurse there, how do you do your vaccination? They vaccinate 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. every day, Monday to Friday, and they close vaccination. So there's no vaccination after 5, there's no vaccination before 9, there's no vaccination Saturday and Sunday. So they vaccinate 30 people on a daily basis for those 5 days. On that particular day, we went there on a Saturday. We vaccinated 352 people in 6 hours from the same community next to the same locality. The challenge that we're having is that people are working. As Professor Rees was saying, people are having to queue hungry, and yet they do informal work, which pays them daily. Every day they miss work, they don't feed their children. So they choose work over vaccination. Now that's not hesitancy. When a woman who needs to deliver in a skilled care center but cannot access the skilled delivery, we don't call her hesitant. We say it's a health system failure. So we need to address health system failures, access and logistics, deliver the vaccines based on people's behavior to where they are working, to the times when they are free, working with religious leaders, going to the communities. When we have exhausted these challenges, then we can deal with hesitancy. But hesitancy is being used as a headline to justify hoarding and actually reduce supply to the continent. We must remove that headline of hesitancy and talk about supply, access, and logistics of vaccines to our people.
Thank you, Dr. Kitinji. Now we're down to our last 2 questions in this round. Quickly, Prof. Slim, on what must be done to increase the number of vaccines on the continent. And after you, Prof. Helen will come in about what paths must be followed to reduce inequalities in accessing public health in the continent.
Thank you very much. Actually, I want to suggest that Professor Rees deals with both questions. He's more eminently qualified than I.
Prof. Rees?
Thank you. I think that if we turn the clock back on vaccine access first, we have 2 really important initiatives. One is within our own region through the AU, which is looking at purchasing vaccines, and the other was the COVAX facility. And they are now working much more closely together than they were at the beginning. But what I can say from my experience with the COVAX facility was that there was a delay in funding. The money just did not flow, so that it was not possible to purchase. And there was a delay from the manufacturers. And I think one of the things we haven't talked about on this panel is, and I think it's worth reflecting on, is what is the dialogue we need to have during COVID and post-COVID with the pharmaceutical industry? Because as we saw, it was partly governments, high-income country governments, who purchased all those vaccines and became the hoarders of vaccines. But it was also the companies that went along with that. Perhaps they, in some cases, had very little choice. But I think there needs to be a diagnostic on what actually happened that stopped the flow of vaccines to the African region. We saw exactly the same thing with pandemic flu. When we had the pandemic, there were vaccines available to high-income countries. When the African region went to look for those vaccines, there were none available. By the time we got vaccines into this continent at that time, the pandemic had been and gone, and thank goodness it wasn't too severe. So I think that there are real questions we have to ask about vaccine numbers, and that is hoarding. It is the high-income countries who behave the same way as they've behaved before, but it's also the pharmaceutical industry. And what is it that's driving them? Is it a profit motive? And where is the altruism? Because I think next time round, and as we go on, there needs to be tiered pricing from the outset and a commitment to access. Then the second thing is the reducing inequalities. That's a really fundamental question for our region. Because the first thing I would say is we need to go back to basics, and that is the social determinants of health. What we know, and we know this also from COVID, is that people who are in the lowest quintiles in socioeconomic status always do worse. You could throw any disease, chronic disease, infectious disease, people will do worse. And that's about social determinants of health. And so the question is, what do we do in terms of development to really lift people up? And we've just heard that things like hunger, which have grown now because of COVID on the continent, are a really important factor. So we have to start right at that basic. But in terms of what we can do, I think that we can now go ahead in terms of health services and be much more creative. We have to think about the models of care. Our models of care are about people walking long distances and queuing for often whole days to see clinics. And the models of care, for example, if you're going to get a measles vaccination with your child, if it means that you have to open a big multi-dose vial for 1 or 2 children, people won't do it. And then people get turned away. So the models of care are not necessarily patient-friendly. And so that's the first thing. The second thing is, one of the problems we also have is that quite a lot of the funding for health in our region comes from vertical programs. So you'll have a measles program and a polio program, and you'll have vertical programs that are not integrated. So you're asking people to one day do something and another day do something else. So it goes back to the earlier comment from the colleague that we need to think about integrated care, primary health care. It goes back to those basics of what we talked about with primary health care. And the third thing I would say is leapfrogging. It's to say, as we did with telephone lines, we didn't have to wait eventually to get the good old-fashioned landline, and we leapfrogged to the cell phone. We need to leapfrog much more. COVID has taught us a lot about how to collect data and how to use data. So I think that use of data and the leapfrogging of technologies is something else we can do in our settings. And then we need to be more practical. One of the lessons from HIV, for example, has to say people who are on chronic medication, you can give them the equivalent of a post box, and they can go and pick up their medication. And only periodically do we need to look at them. So we need to rethink the way that we're delivering our services in low resource settings fundamentally. And we've talked about this a lot, but we're still doing things very much in the traditional clinic-based, the patient goes there, they wait a long time and they go away. Social determinants of health and remodeling of the health services.
Thank you, Professor Rees. And I think we'll pose a last question to Dr. John. As colleagues know, the conference launching yesterday looks at a new public order for Africa. We've got experts from different parts of the world. And just in terms of pushing that agenda forward, Dr. John, I want to pose this last question to you. And it says, on the basis of political will and leadership, which is essential for strengthening public health on the continent, has Africa's CDC sensitized Pan-African Parliament about enacting legislation and also seeking to enhance this and promote this new public health order. What steps has Africa CDC taken towards that? And that is our last question before we go to last remarks from our speakers.
No, thank you. I mean, there's this is just a beginning, and you can already see the sensitization work that has gone in collectively from everyone on this panel to those who spoke yesterday. The fact that the head of state, political leadership of the continent is speaking to that and articulating it with specifics is very important. We will need to develop a roadshow where the parliamentarians will be engaged and other stakeholders, and also bring in our partners. I mean, the traditional partners that we work with, both the multilaterals as well as the bilaterals, to really make sure that they understand us and they hear us, that the things we are advocating are exactly what they are advocating. We want to be very sure that when we come out of this pandemic, we have things that can be measured. In good public health practice, is if you count is based on the principle that if you count things, they get done, and things that are get done are supported. So I think the concept of a new public health order is anything that those are basic concepts that everybody would agree with, and we will need to socialize them more and more with the groups that are the constituencies that are just indicated. So watch out for the next coming weeks and months ahead.
Thank you. We'll start with you, Dr. Ebere. Any closing remarks for our media colleagues?
Yes, as part of this new public health order, the African Union has led through working with Africa CDC, a continental response to actually start to address the gaps in our health security. And the Partnership for Africa Vaccine Manufacturing, which Dr. John referred to, is actually now moving forward to creating that ecosystem so that we can start to develop our own R&D, our own regulatory framework, strengthen our regulatory frameworks, have our own resources for investment, and looking at what should we actually be manufacturing as part of our responsibility to own our global health security agenda. You need to be an equal partner in the global conversation. That means that you have to have something to bring to the table. So we are building that. And the strengthening national public health institutions is part of that whole architecture. Bringing that expertise together through this conference, actually showing that although we acknowledge and accept that we have far less resource in terms of expert workforce and manpower that we need across the continent, we do have eminent scientists, researchers, public health leaders, and we need to actually recognize and optimize what we have best, and then work with our partners so that we can actually be standing on equal ground and actually having partnerships of mutual respect, recognizing what we need and what they bring, what we bring to work collaboratively. So this new public health order, which this conference is reflecting, is actually about resetting the dial in the partnership that African countries and the African continent is having in the globe to say, hang on, we have something to offer here, and we want to actually be having a conversation as partners with mutual respect. And it's really exciting to see, if you've been on it yesterday and today, the richness of the conversation and the science that's coming out of this conference was, I said to Dr. John yesterday, was, it was emotional to see us as Africans saying, hang on, this is us, this is what we have, and this is what we can do.
Thank you. We'll have Prof. Rees and then Prof. Kitinji and Prof. Slim can close.
Thank you. Well, I would say in closing that there's one big thing that we mustn't do, and that's have a big flurry of response and activity and commitment and then become complacent and forget it. I'm remembering that our leadership, our political leadership, signed the Addis Agreement on vaccines, I'm thinking now 8 years ago. And that committed, one of the things that was asked for was vaccine manufacture. And it was a strong commitment, but we didn't move on it. What we can't do now is to take our own foot off our own regional pedal. We've got to keep this going. And similarly, I think that some of the challenges that have come out from the region to global leadership also have to be sustained. And whether that is challenging people's nonsensical responses, non-evidence-based nonsensical responses in terms of the pandemic, which have been prejudicial to the region, or whether it's a fundamental question like tiered pricing and intellectual property and the sharing of intellectual property. We can't just stop now just because perhaps with any luck we get into a more chronic state with COVID and it becomes less of an immediate pressure. Thank you.
I'll go ahead and comment, Sikelewa. And the point I want to make here is that, especially for the media, let us not join the bandwagon down the garden path on the headline of hesitancy. It is a narrative that has been drafted to ensure that Africa does not continue to access supplies which are being hoarded for that doses and we don't know and God knows what and fourth doses and whatever else that needs to be done. You saw what happened in South Africa when they announced this that Professor Karim has talked about, and then the world went ahead and said no one from this region should travel. Yet the same variant was next door to all these countries that were actually. So it's a narrative that we must resist. The issue we need to focus on is disaggregate the data in your country, and you will find that, as Professor Rees has said, the people who are least vaccinated are the people who have least access to healthcare anyway in your country. If I look at my country, Nairobi, which is the capital city, has a vaccine penetration of 40%. But what is Kenya's average? 9%. So if you look at the 9%, you have to go deep and find that the counties that have the lowest skill delivery, the lowest access to DPT or measles vaccines, the lowest access to other health services, have 2% uptick of vaccines. So when you go, you look at that, you then realize that it's actually not a hesitancy issue. The issue we must focus on, and I'm pleading with the media to call out, is access and logistics. And go back to your country and mobilize your people to actually demand for access to health services. When they have access to health services, then vaccine uptake will be sorted automatically. Let's not take this narrative of hesitancy, which is created by those who are holding vaccines away from our people.
Thank you very much, Dr. Githai. So I'll just wrap up by pointing out that COVID-19 as a crisis presents an opportunity. And that opportunity is for us to seize with both hands to build public health in Africa. And if you were present, as I was yesterday, what you saw was an amazing showcase. What we saw was the African CDC with many of its partners wheeling out for the world to see some amazing science, some terrific work. And all of that is a building block. We are building and we are laying those foundations for those who will follow on us. And how we build those foundations will depend on the house that they build will depend on how strong we build those foundations. And we build foundations not because we do individual actions by themselves, but those individual actions collectively lead to stronger institutions. What we have to leave behind for the next generation are strong public health institutions that will be able to rise to the next set of challenges we face with pandemics and health more broadly. On that note, thank you.
Thank you, Prof. Slim. And I think I'll hand over to the host of this historic meeting, Dr. John, to give us his final closing for this press briefing. And also just a call to action for us as Africans as we go into the holiday. And also some of the things that we just need to keep in mind around strengthening our health systems, but also as individual Africans, what actions we can take as we move forward. Dr. John, your parting shot?
No, thank you. My parting shot is really encapsulated in the spirit of this dialogue, that this is the moment for Africa. This is the moment to take advantage of this crisis and build back better, bolder, and stronger and bigger for continent. And that will be driven by this new public health order, which is nothing but a very crystal clear direction of what we believe we should do to emerge from this crisis and look stronger and prepare for the next pandemic. So again, let me just, because probably I would not have the chance to talk to the media before the holiday season. Wish everybody a happy holiday season. But again, end with my usual remarks. We are in an upward trend towards the fourth wave, which is arriving at a very dangerous time for the continent because the festivity seasons will kick in soon. So as we go out and enjoy very much deserved end of year festivities, let's make sure we do that safe. And let's make sure that we spread facts, not fear. Let's not be afraid of the Omicron. Let's spread the facts. The facts are that if you wear your mask, you social distance, avoid large crowds there, we will be fine. And go out there and get your vaccine. We will all be fine as we enjoy our end of year holiday season. Thank you so much for the opportunity and for the very lively conversations.
And thank you to our speakers and our media colleagues. Again, the conference is running until tomorrow, and you can visit www.CPHIA-2021.com, and you'll get the program, and you're also able to join and register and join some of the fantastic conversation that's taking place. If you have any questions, you can reach out to the Africa CDC Comms team. I know that some of the colleagues here, they've got them on the WhatsApp group and other different platforms of communication. Thank you, and good evening, good morning to those who are joining in the morning, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.